Right now, as you're watching this, somewhere in Russia, an oil terminal is on fire. Not because of an accident, not because of a malfunction, because a drone made of plywood built in a basement outside Kyiv just flew over 1,000 kilometers through Russian airspace, dodged every air defense system Moscow has, and slammed into a fuel tank the size of an apartment building. And the man who sent it? Russia just sentenced him to life in prison. In absentia, of course, because they can't catch him. His name is Robert Brovdy, call sign Magyar, a former grain trader from a small town near the Hungarian border who now commands the most effective drone force on the planet. And in the last 6 weeks, his campaign has done something no Western sanction, no diplomatic threat, and no military operation has managed to do in 4 years of war. It has shut down 40% of Russia's oil export capacity. 2 million barrels a day, gone. The most severe oil supply disruption in modern Russian history. That's not my assessment, that's Reuters. And here's the part that makes this story unlike anything else in this war. Ukraine's own allies, the countries sending billions in weapons and aid, asked Kyiv to stop. They said the strikes were pushing global oil prices too high. They said it was destabilizing energy markets already wrecked by the war in Iran. Ukraine said no. And by the end of this, you'll understand exactly why they refused, and why that decision might be the smartest strategic move Kyiv has made since the start of this war. Let's break it down. To understand what Ukraine just pulled off, you need to know one number. Russia earns roughly 60% of its federal budget from oil and gas. Not half, not a third, 60%. Take that away and you don't have a country running a war, you have a country struggling to keep the lights on. Ukraine figured this out back in 2023. After the counteroffensive stalled along 1,200 kilometers of front line, Kyiv's generals faced a brutal truth. They couldn't outgun Russia, they couldn't outman Russia, but they could outthink Russia, and the weapon they chose wasn't a missile or a tank. It was a disposable drone that cost $55,000 and is built from plywood cut on a laser machine, the FP1. Designed by a company called Firepoint, founded by 3 guys with zero military background, a film location scout, an IT entrepreneur, and a concrete factory owner. They started in November 2022 with 12 people. By mid-2025, they were producing 100 drones a day. By March 2026, 200 a day, across more than 50 hidden workshops scattered throughout Ukraine. Each FP1 carries 105 kilograms of explosives over 1,000 kilometers. It flies low, it flies slow. It navigates without GPS, using a terrain-matching camera system that Firepoint developed through 7 generations of software in 3 years. 7 generations, under constant Russian electronic warfare, jamming, and spoofing. Every time Moscow found a way to block the signal, Firepoint rewrote the code. The drone doesn't need satellites. It reads the ground like a map. And here's the number that should keep every Russian oil executive awake at night. Firepoint says it can triple production at any time. That's 600 deep strike drones per day. At $55,000 each, while Russia pays nearly $200,000 for a single Shahed, Ukraine is building its air force out of plywood, and it's winning. But the drones were only half the equation. The other half was knowing exactly where to aim them, and that's where the campaign got surgical. Ukraine didn't scatter its strikes randomly across Russia. It picked 3 pressure points and hit all of them at once. The first target was the Baltic Sea, Primorsk and Ust-Luga, 2 ports in the Leningrad region, northwest Russia, that together handle a massive share of Russian crude exports to Europe and Asia. In late March, Ukrainian drones flew more than 1,000 kilometers from the border, crossed into Russian airspace undetected, and struck both terminals on consecutive nights. Satellite images showed storage tanks erupting in flames that burned for days. Governor Alexander Drozdenko confirmed a fuel pipeline was ruptured at Primorsk. At Ust-Luga, buildings across the sprawling oil complex were damaged. Loading operations were suspended. Industry sources told Reuters both ports went offline. The second target was the Black Sea. Novorossiysk, Russia's largest oil export hub on its southern coast. On April 6th, swarms of Ukrainian drones hit the port overnight. Fires broke out at the docks, a pipeline was damaged, loading berths were wrecked. Regional Governor Veniamin Kondratiev called it the most serious attack the city had experienced. 8 people were injured. But the real damage wasn't human, it was economic. Novorossiysk handles 700,000 barrels a day. On the same night, Ukraine's drone forces commander, Robert Brovdy, confirmed his units also struck the Admiral Makarov, a Russian Black Sea frigate sitting in the port, and a drilling rig offshore. And then came the third layer, the refineries themselves, deep inside Russia. The Lukoil refinery in Kstovo, Nizhny Novgorod region, 800 kilometers from the Ukrainian border, hit on April 5th. The Norsy refinery, Russia's 4th largest, struck the same weekend. The Kurishi refinery in the Leningrad region, which processes 7% of all Russian refined oil, hit days later. The Bashneft Novoil refinery in Ufa, one of Russia's biggest lubricant producers, confirmed struck on April 3rd. And an oil pumping station in Krasnodar on April 9th. Ports, pipelines, refineries, pumping stations, from the Gulf of Finland to the shores of the Black Sea. All within 2 weeks. And the results were staggering. According to Reuters, 40% of Russia's oil export capacity, roughly 2 million barrels per day, went offline. Refining capacity dropped 17%. That's 1.1 million barrels a day of processing power, just gone. The International Energy Agency reported that Russia's total oil exports in February had already plunged to 6.6 million barrels a day, the lowest since the invasion began, and that was before the March and April strikes made everything worse. Now, everything I've told you so far is the military side of the story, the drones, the fires, the shattered terminals. But the part that truly changes the equation isn't about what Ukraine destroyed, it's about what happened to Russia's money. Because the Kremlin was counting on a windfall, and Ukraine set it on fire at the exact moment Moscow needed it most. Here's where the irony hits like a sledgehammer. In late February 2026, the United States and Israel launched airstrikes against Iran. Within weeks, Tehran shut down the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which 20% of the world's oil supply passes every single day. The IEA called it the greatest threat to global energy security in history. Oil prices exploded. Brent crude crossed $100 a barrel for the first time since 2022. And suddenly, every country on Earth was scrambling for alternative supply. Russia should have been the biggest winner. Moscow had oil, Moscow had tankers, Moscow had willing buyers in China and India lining up with open checkbooks. The Kremlin even got a gift from Washington. On March 12th, the United States issued a temporary sanctions waiver allowing countries to purchase Russian crude stranded at sea, specifically to calm global markets. For a brief moment, it looked like the Iran war was going to hand Vladimir Putin a lifeline worth billions. And in the first 2 weeks of the conflict, it did. Russia reportedly earned an extra $6.9 billion as oil prices surged. Bloomberg calculated that Russian weekly oil export revenues hit $2.48 billion, the highest since April 2022. The Kremlin started quietly shelving plans to downgrade its economic growth forecast. Defense spending stayed locked at $157 billion. Putin told business leaders behind closed doors that Russia would keep fighting until it reached the administrative borders of Donetsk and Luhansk. The money was flowing again, the war machine was refueling, and then Ukraine lit a match. The timing was not an accident. Kyiv watched the Iran crisis unfold. It watched oil prices climb. It watched Russia prepare to cash in on a global catastrophe. And it made a calculated decision. If Moscow was about to get rich off someone else's war, Ukraine would make sure the money never arrived. The drone campaign that followed was the most concentrated assault on Russian energy infrastructure in the entire war. Strike after strike after strike, night after night, Baltic to Black Sea. And the effect was devastating. Russia's oil tax revenue in March collapsed 48% year over year. Producers paid just $6.18 billion in oil taxes, against a budget that assumed $59 barrels and stable exports. Combined oil and gas federal revenue dropped 43%. Bloomberg called it a revenue halving. The Kyiv School of Economics estimated that February exports had already fallen to their lowest point since the invasion, and that was the baseline Ukraine then cratered even further. Think about what that means. The biggest oil price spike in years, and Russia couldn't capitalize on it. The pumps were broken, the ports were burning, the pipelines were ruptured. Moscow had the product, Moscow had the demand, but it couldn't physically get the oil out of the country. It was like winning the lottery and then watching the check catch fire in your hand. And that's when the phone call started. Kirilo Budanov, head of Ukraine's presidential office, gave an interview to Bloomberg on April 4th. He confirmed what many had suspected. Foreign allies, countries that arm and fund Ukraine, had asked Kyiv to stop hitting Russian refineries. The oil strikes, they said, were adding fuel to an already burning global energy crisis. With Iran choking off the Strait of Hormuz and prices climbing past $100, every barrel taken offline was making things worse for Western consumers. Gas stations in Texas, heating bills in Berlin, inflation projections in London. Budanov chose his words carefully. "Let's answer this diplomatically," he said. "We are receiving certain signals about this." He did not name which countries made the request. He did not say Ukraine would comply. And the answer to whether Kyiv would change its tactics came not from a press conference, but from the sky over Russia the very next night. On April 5th, Ukrainian drones struck the Lukoil refinery in Kostovo and the oil terminal at Primorsk. On April 6th, they hit Novorossiysk. On April 9th, an oil pumping station in Krasnodar. On April 11th, another wave hit Ust-Luga, the largest overnight drone attack of the entire year. Ukraine didn't pause. Ukraine accelerated. And the logic behind that decision reveals something fundamental about how Kyiv sees this war. For Ukraine, every barrel of Russian oil that reaches a port is not just revenue, it is ammunition. It is a shell fired at Odessa. It is a Shahed drone launched at a power station in Kharkiv. It is a glide bomb dropped on an apartment block in Dnipro. Russia's oil doesn't just fund a budget, it funds a killing machine that has taken more than 15,000 civilian lives since 2022. When your allies ask you to stop destroying the enemy's wallet because gasoline in Ohio costs too much, you are being asked to trade your survival for someone else's convenience. Volodymyr Zelensky made the calculus public. He said Ukraine would stop striking Russian energy infrastructure only if Russia stopped striking Ukrainian energy infrastructure first. A symmetrical offer. A reasonable condition. And everyone knew Russia would never accept it, because Russia had spent the entire winter destroying Ukrainian power stations, leaving millions of people without electricity and heat in temperatures of minus 20 Celsius. Moscow started this energy war. Kyiv simply decided to finish it. But the diplomatic tension exposed something deeper, something the Allies perhaps didn't want to acknowledge. Ukraine's drone campaign was working. Not symbolically, not marginally. It was delivering the kind of economic damage that 4 years of Western sanctions had failed to achieve on this scale. 40% of export capacity offline, revenue halved, budget projections shattered. And it was being done not with billion-dollar weapons packages or complex financial instruments, but with plywood drones assembled in hidden workshops by a company that didn't exist 3 years ago. The man Russia sentenced to life in prison, Robert Brovdy, the former grain trader from Uzhhorod, was doing more damage to the Kremlin's war machine from a buried command bunker than the entire Western sanctions apparatus had done from boardrooms in Brussels and Washington. And that uncomfortable fact is what made the phone calls happen. Not concern for global stability, embarrassment. But there is one more twist to this story, because the very thing that made Ukraine's campaign so devastating is also the thing that made it so dangerous. Ukraine's strikes didn't just hit Russian oil. They hit the Caspian Pipeline Consortium terminal at Novorossiysk, a facility that handles 1.5% of global oil supply. Its shareholders include Chevron and ExxonMobil, American companies, American assets, damaged by Ukrainian drones in a war America is helping to fund. The Russian Defense Ministry seized on this immediately, accusing Kyiv of deliberately targeting international energy companies to inflict maximum economic harm on the United States and Kazakhstan. And that accusation, cynical as it was, contained a grain of strategic truth. Ukraine's campaign had crossed an invisible line. It was no longer just hurting Russia, it was shaking the foundations of global energy markets at the worst possible moment. Oil from Iran, offline. Oil from Russia, burning. Two of the world's largest producers crippled simultaneously. The IEA warned of supply losses of 10 to 11 million barrels per day. Analysts at Freedom Finance estimated that every $10 increase in oil prices hands the Russian budget an extra $1.6 billion per month. So even as Ukraine destroyed export capacity on one end, rising prices were partially compensating Moscow on the other. This is the paradox Kyiv now lives inside. Strike too little, and Russia rebuilds, reloads, and keeps killing. Strike too much, and global prices spike high enough to accidentally refill the very war chest you are trying to drain. The sweet spot, maximum physical damage at minimum price impact, requires a level of precision that no army has ever attempted with weapons this cheap. And yet Ukraine is finding it. Because there is a critical difference between oil that exists underground and oil that can actually reach a buyer. Russia still has crude. What it doesn't have are functioning ports to load it, pipelines to move it, or refineries to process it. The price on a screen in London means nothing if the tanker in Primorsk can't fill its hull because the loading berth is a pile of scorched metal. Ukraine understood this before anyone else. You don't need to sanction a barrel of oil if you can physically prevent it from leaving the country. The residents of St. Petersburg are learning this the hard way. After the strikes on Primorsk and Ust-Luga, fires burned for days at terminals less than 200 kilometers from the city. People reported smelling burning diesel and rotten eggs from their apartments. One resident told Al Jazeera he never thought the war would reach his doorstep, not as soldiers, but as smoke. Once again, we were fooled about why we'd gone to war, he said, and about the government's ability to protect us. That smell is the smell of a strategy collapsing. For 4 years, Moscow sold its citizens a story that the war in Ukraine was distant, manageable, and under control, that life at home would continue as normal, that the economy was resilient, that the West was weak. And now the fires are visible from Putin's hometown. The budget is bleeding out, and a man with a call sign from a minority language Russia barely acknowledges is running a drone army that Moscow cannot stop, cannot catch, and cannot outproduce. Russia's air defenses claim to intercept dozens of Ukrainian drones every night, and every morning something new is burning. 125 drones downed in one night over 13 regions, and a refinery processing 7% of all Russian fuel still caught fire. The math doesn't work. You can shoot down 90% and still lose the war of attrition when the other side builds 200 a day at a fraction of what your interceptors cost. This is what the next phase of this war looks like. Not trenches, not tanks, not negotiating tables. A country of 40 million people, outspent and outgunned, methodically disassembling the economic engine of a nuclear superpower, one $55,000 drone at a time. And the world asked them to stop. They didn't. Because they understood something the diplomats hadn't figured out yet. You don't win a war by making your enemy comfortable. You win it by making sure he can't afford to fight. If this gave you a clearer picture of what's really happening in this war, I'd appreciate it if you hit that like button. It helps more people find this channel. And if you're not subscribed yet, now's a good time. We cover these stories every day and things are moving fast. Tap subscribe, turn on the bell so you don't miss the next one, and if you have a thought on this, whether you agree, disagree, or see something I missed, drop it in the comments. I read them. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.